All right, welcome everyone to our first Ask the Waterkeeper series of short videos. We came up with the this series or this webinar, whatever we want to call it, Ask the Waterkeeper, because we noticed that quite regularly we get quite a few questions about things going on in our watershed, and obviously that changes depending on the hot topic of the issue of the month or recently, and we get often a number of questions through email. And so we're going to be encouraging people to contribute, to submit your questions. You can do this at any time if you want to email your question to info@lakeworthwaterkeeper.org. You want to make sure to put in the subject, Ask the Waterkeeper, or I have a question, or something similar, and we'll work best to answer it. And often we answer individual emails, but sometimes, like this time, we often get a question that is so good that encourage us to use a platform like a webinar to give a little bit more detailed answer, because some things are really important for our watershed, and some things kind of warrant a deeper description of what is going on. And so today we have a question from Joy. Put that up here. And Joy's question is, I understand that all 7 seagrasses grow in the Lake Worth Lagoon, which is rare. The manatee's food source, seagrasses, are diminishing due to human population growth in Florida. It doesn't make sense to allow this development to take place in this protected area where the manatees thrive. Am I correct in assuming this? We should be protecting the seagrasses and the manatees, as well as other small animals. And those are great questions. Is she correct? Is anyone correct to assume that such incredible habitats like seagrasses warrants more protection from development threats? Absolutely. This question definitely came in response to a newspaper piece, an opinion piece that was written regarding our fight. We're partnered with Everglades Law Center, and we have a fairly prominent fight in an area in a Lake Worth Lagoon known as Munyon Cove. And Munyon Cove is the last best stronghold of seagrass in the Lake Worth Lagoon. It's a really special place for us, and it's under threat from numerous developers, one of which also happens to be the chairperson of the FWC, which is a bit outrageous. And that really exemplifies, or that is such a good example of why habitats like seagrass and mangroves are constantly under threat. And before we get to the policy and government and legal issues of that, I'm going to introduce Maddie. Maddie is a recent joiner to our team here at Lake Worth Waterkeeper, and we're really excited because if my background, as many people already know, is in law and Everglades law and constitutional law, Maddie's background is in science. And it just so happens that she knows quite a bit about seagrass. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it to her, and she will be able to introduce herself and talk about why seagrasses are important, and hopefully talk about some of the work that we're planning to do as Lake Worth Waterkeeper.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for the introduction, Ray. I'm very excited to be part of the Lake Worth Waterkeeper team and to work on our water quality monitoring program and to work with all of you to protect the lagoon. So to answer Joy's question, no, it doesn't make sense to develop these areas, especially if we care about the health of our lagoon. Development has many harmful effects on water quality and hence seagrass cover in the lagoon. And so I'm going to explain some of these for you guys. So naturally, without human disturbance, the shoreline of the lagoon consists mostly of red and black mangroves, salt marsh grasses, and other wetland plants. And even in the northern part of the lagoon, there are some oyster reefs as well that also can make up part of the living shoreline. These plants and the oysters remove pollutants and nutrients. They secure sediments, they slow water inflow, and they trap debris from stormwater runoff before it enters the lagoon. And so they effectively serve as a filter for water as it goes into the lagoon. In the northern part of the lagoon where the oysters are, these oysters also filter the water as well, and they remove extra particles and nutrients from the water column and add a little bit of extra clarity where they're present. So when these shorelines are developed, a lot of the time, these living shorelines are replaced with buildings, with docks, and marinas. So this has a harmful effect because it removes this filter from the shoreline, and it basically allows dirty water to dump straight into the lagoon, and this is a major threat to water quality, as well as water clarity, which will also decline as this runoff is no longer filtered. It adds nutrients and sediment into the lagoon. So poor water quality is a major problem for seagrass growth, mainly because murky water blocks some of the sunlight from reaching the seagrasses below. And as a plant, seagrasses need sunlight to photosynthesize and to grow. So where the water is really dirty and really murky, it's really difficult for seagrasses to get established. Another thing that affects seagrass cover is excess nutrients and fertilizers, as well as organic waste. And with development that occurs and replaces our natural shorelines, concentrations of these chemicals and nutrients increases again. And these nutrients in particular can lead to algal blooms, which also block sunlight from the seagrasses below. If you've ever seen a green, thick mat of cyanobacteria on top of the lagoon, you know that this area is really polluted and really murky usually, and it blocks sunlight, almost all sunlight if it gets very dense from the seagrass below. So in summary, development removes these very important living shorelines and filters from the lagoon and causes a reduction in water quality and in water clarity, which has a really harmful effect on seagrass survival. And seagrasses work together also with the living shorelines when they are able to get established. They also trap sediments and remove excess nutrients from the water. But in addition to this, they offer extra services like adding oxygen to the water column, like all fish and shark need to breathe. They provide important food and nursery habitat to many animals like manatees, fish, invertebrates, and sea turtles. So as these animals are young, as they're juveniles, they usually grow up in seagrass beds because one, they provide important food source, and two, they provide cover and shelter from predators, as allows them to grow larger without the threat of predation being eaten. A lot of our seafood will come from seagrass beds. As it grows up and enters the ocean, it'll start in a seagrass bed to mature. And lastly, seagrasses also trap a really large amount of carbon dioxide, so much so that 1 hectare of seagrass can soak up as much CO2 as about 15 hectares of rainforest, which is really significant in mitigating our carbon emissions to mitigate climate change. So regarding seagrass diversity, as Joy was so kind to mention, a study by Chesnes et al. In 2011 did find 7 different species of seagrasses in the Lake Worth Cove, which is the northern part of the lagoon. I'm going to pull up a map here so you guys can see. Bear with me. I am figuring out how. Lake Worth Lagoon. On the left, there's the northernmost part. Bear with me, this is my first live stream ever, guys. The lagoon, you can see that it's greener, that there is less development along the shoreline, and the northernmost part of the Lake Worth Cove is blown up in the second figure on the right. And so this study found that the most abundant species were Haliduli wrightii, which is shoal grass. I'm going to pull up a picture for you guys. As well as followed by Syringodium filiforme, which is manatee grass, which is the manatee's main source of food. And then lastly, the third most abundant species was Johnson's seagrass, or Halophila johnsonii. And this is the only federally protected species of plant in the United States, which is significant because it's endemic or native to this area. So as I mentioned, most of the seagrass cover is found in the northernmost part of the lagoon. I don't know why it's not showing me, guys. I'm sorry. There we go. And this is the least developed section of the lagoon, which allows a large area of living shoreline to thrive here. And it also receives the cleanest water straight from the ocean through the Palm Beach Inlet. And because of this, the water is the cleanest as it's entered into the north, but it gradually gets dirtier and murkier as it moves south, mainly because of all of the nutrient runoff from the C-51 and other canals further west. So this is a major problem for seagrasses, especially further south in the lagoon. The Lake Worth Lagoon Management Plan reports that from 2018 to 2020, there was a 56% decline in seagrass cover in the northern lagoon, which is where about 87% of the seagrass in all of the Lake Worth Lagoon lives. And there's also a 55% decline in the southern lagoon. And this may sound like a lot of seagrass decline, and that's because it is. This is a lot of decline to happen in only 2 years. But the precise cause of this is still not very certain. It's likely a result of increased development and runoff, which really unfortunately intensifies as population continues to grow. So in summary, to protect seagrasses, we really need more living shoreline as well as cleaner incoming water. So thank you, Joy, for asking your question. I'm going to turn it back over to Ray.
Thank you so much, Maddie. As Maddie pointed out, seagrasses, they really do play a critical role. Living shorelines are definitely a really big start in how we can protect and bring back seagrass and these habitat. Dr. Chesness from Palm Beach Atlantic has been doing some research in the Lake Worth Cove in MacArthur Beach State Park, where he has highlighted that, or we're starting to see seagrass doing a little bit better in that area as things like that oyster reef and living shoreline projects are introduced to the area. We as Lake Worth Waterkeeper, we maintain the living shoreline projects. We adopted them at Bryant Park in Lake Worth and Jewel Steinhardt Cove, also in Lake Worth, near Snook Islands. And being someone who grew up in the area, I can tell you that we used to never fish that area of the Lake Worth Lagoon because there really wasn't much there, right? And when the living shoreline projects were put into place, things like the seagrass, the fisheries came back, other animals came back, and it started looking more like the habitat that it's supposed to be. And so how does that translate to the lack of protection that seagrasses have? Well, we need to understand that Lake Worth Lagoon as a water body, it has a really unique history, and that really sets the tone for the policy side of environmental protection and legal side, in that the Lake Worth Lagoon often gets excluded from important water management decisions, from important environmental studies, and so on and so forth, especially ones that are going to be funded by government, because the Lake Worth Lagoon wasn't always a coastal estuary. Now we recognize it as a northern estuary of the Greater Everglades system, and that wasn't always the case up until still now, and certain pieces of federal law you'll have a legally defined section that says northern estuary of Lake Worth Lagoon. It's the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie, and it specifically excludes the Lake Worth Lagoon because they can do that since the Lake Worth Lagoon wasn't always a coastal estuary. It wasn't even always an estuary up until a little over 100 years ago. It was actually a landlocked freshwater lake. And so, I want you to think it was like lily pads, alligators, kind of exactly what you would think the rest of the Everglades look like, what most people think of. And then, starting late 19th century, as people moved into the area, the canals were built to drain the Everglades agriculture area south of Lake Okeechobee, which is what disconnected the lower Everglades from the rest of the greater Everglades system. And then around that same time, the Lake Worth Lagoon had two inlets cut, the Lake Worth and the South Lake Worth Inlet. That's what brought saltwater in, and that's what turned this freshwater lake into a coastal estuary. And so what that means is our lagoon has its entire existence is due to development. And that still continues to this day. So around the same time that the inlets were cut, the other grand idea, and we still see these remnants throughout, is how many think that the best way to protect a shoreline is shoreline hardening, right? And shoreline hardening is building a seawall. And we've gotten to the point where the Lake Worth Lagoon, its entire shoreline inshore, 80% of that is seawall, and the remaining 20%, the natural shoreline. The natural shoreline is what's going to provide the best quality habitat. It's where you're going to find your seagrass and your healthiest mangroves. The vast majority of that is going to be in the northern section of the lagoon. So as Maddie pointed out, the healthiest part of the lagoon in terms of seagrass habitat is the northern end. And that's no coincidence. That's just because that is where it almost sounds a little bit absurd to say, but that is where the least amount of development has happened around the Lake Worth Lagoon, right? And obviously, there's still a lot of development, and that development is still going on. A lot of it is still being threatened, and that's kind of what inspired this question, because that area of Munyon Cove is threatened by a number of developers, by three of them specifically, who continue to threaten filling in the cove to build a marina or floating docks, different development projects that would cause irreversible damage to Munyon Cove, specifically to the mangroves and the seagrass. We can build living shorelines. They're great in already affected areas, but realistically, when it comes to environment and engineering, a man-made living shoreline is phenomenal and an improvement over something like a seawall, except it's never going to be 100% of what nature created. So the remnant, the natural stuff that does exist, must be protected. And considering development is the number one threat to these areas, that is, that's where you're going to find where these protections are lacking. And what I mean is the things that are just hurting these kinds of habitats, they're all rooted in things like growth management laws, right? Your local communities, your local coastal towns, your commissioners voting on development plans and approving these projects, or the local development regulations, what we call LDRs, which are basically a part of planning and zoning laws. All these policies are offering, these are the things that are going to protect these seagrasses, especially in the Lake Worth Lagoon. So it's really important when we select people to lead our cities and encourage them on what our priorities are, especially when it comes to development. It's really important. Often the only protection we have is people showing up, the community showing up to these meetings and letting the city know that as a priority, we want these habitats protected over whatever proposed development is threatening it. And so we have those local regulations, we have those local fights, and sometimes, organizations like us, like Lake Worth Waterkeeper, we're going to have to continue to take that fight to the next level, and that usually means going to court with these developers. And what we see there, similar to how planning and zoning laws often favor the developer, and commissioners usually favor a developer because developers love making campaign contributions. Similarly, what we see is, as the product of years of Florida legislation not being aligned with our environment, is we're seeing our rights to challenge these sort of environmental destructions in court being eroded away. And I have two examples that I want to discuss to highlight, because they're two examples that people can take and take an action on. At least one of them is, and that first one is, we can talk about some of the policy changes that, these are the kinds of things that often you might see a headline in the newspapers, but it's usually not going to be front page news. And yet these are the things that have tremendous impact on our environment. And one of the recent ones is, not too long ago, our state, or led by the Governor DeSantis, took on an initiative to take on what we call 404 permitting. And 404 permits are, they're wetland destroying permits. So imagine if you're a developer, or you want to build something, you have a property, but there's a wetland in your way. The first thing you have to do is you have to apply, one of the first things you have to do is apply for this permit that will give you permission to destroy the wetland. And for decades, when we've had this environmental regulation in play, it was the federal government that handled those applications. Specifically, it was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And up until recently, where Governor DeSantis in Florida decided, under the excuse that the permitting process needed to be more streamlined, they took that process and they made Florida's DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, take on that process. In the comments, I just shared a link from a great piece that was written by Amber, who works for the Conservancy of Southwest Florida in Naples. And she really hits the nail on the head on that piece. It came out today, and it points out that, there was this excuse of streamlining the application process, but realistically, in practice, the DEP has been flooded, and they're almost in over their head because they don't have the resources to process these applications. They're overburdened, and the end result, what we end up seeing, is a lot of these permits are being rubber stamped and approved with minimal evidence, minimal actual justification to pass these permits. Another thing that we always have to deal with, especially as a nonprofit and especially as litigants, is a concept called standing. And standing is a really important thing, because it's essentially your right or our right to take a case to court. And it is the one thing that developers always attack us on, because most of the time, pretty much all of the time, we have the science and the law on our side, right? Very specifically, you look at a place like Munyon Cove and what we're doing to the developers there, the science is on our side. Maddie talked about the seagrass that's found in Munyon Cove, how important they are to different species, what they do for climate change. There's a million and one reasons why we need to protect seagrass, and the science is on our side. And in court, as long as we get a chance to argue our case, then we generally have a fairly good chance at accomplishing what we need to accomplish. So what a developer will do is they don't focus on the science. They generally like to attack our standing, our right to bring the case in court. So they are essentially saying, yeah, somebody like Ronaldo and Maddie and Lake Worth Waterkeeper, sure, they might have good science and saying why we can't build this project, but you know what? Ronaldo lives so many miles away or whatever, or the organization, they're not going to be impacted by this development. Therefore, they shouldn't even be allowed to have a say in this court. And that is a constant battle that every nonprofit has to face. Every case we do, it can be difficult at times because you can imagine, as a nonprofit, we're limited on our resources. We're going against sometimes really powerful, influential attorneys that seem to have an unlimited budget in how they run their cases. So it's usually a test of endurance. Can we take this battle on to where we need it to go? Once we get that standing, it's usually a good thing for us, but that's such a major obstacle for us to get over. And so I'm going to share another link in the comments, something that I hope everyone pays attention to, and that's what's called the Florida Five, florida5.org. And what it is, it's a number of amendments that are being proposed for Florida's Constitution. One of them is a really big standout. One of them is what we call the Rights of Nature. And Rights of Nature is a movement that often started largely in Central South America, and it's based a lot on indigenous knowledge and belief. And essentially what it's saying is the old way of how we do court here, where us as a nonprofit and environmental organization, we have to prove how we're going to be impacted as an organization in order to be allowed to argue our case in court, right? And so what the Rights of Nature movement does is it foregoes that, and it allows us as an environmental organization to bring a case, not because of our work and the things that we do, but it allows us to bring a case on behalf of the watershed itself. So, take something like Lake Worth Lagoon, like Caloosahatchee River, like the St. Lucie River, for example, Indian River Lagoon. We can theoretically, with Rights of Nature, we'll be able to go to court and be like, it's not about us. Here's our science. Here's our work. But we're representing, in essence, the water body itself. And it really harkens back to the indigenous belief that all life is important. It's also, we love it as an organization because one of our central tenets of Lake Worth Waterkeeper is what we know as biocentrism, which is the focus that we as humans were really just a part of this community. And this community includes all the plants and animals and habitats and everything around us, the environment. We're just a piece of it. We're not the center of it. And things like plants and animals and even water bodies themselves deserve to have their own rights as if they were a person. And to the people who say, well, that sounds kind of ridiculous. How could a water body have any rights as if it was a person? Well, look at Citizens United and other opinions. How in that same name, how can a corporation like a development firm have rights as if they were an individual person in various capacities throughout government and policy? If we're going to give corporations and these fictional organizations, or these corporations, partnerships, whatever you want to call them, these businesses, rights as if they were a person, then it makes perfect sense to me that a water body and any other life on this planet should be allotted those same rights. So on that link that I sent in the comments, it's a simple URL, fl5.org. There's a number of amendments on there. I think all of them are good, but the Rights of Nature is on there. And that's a real direct thing that you can do, because if enough signatures are collected, what ends up happening is the end goal is that this amendment will be elected on by everyone in Florida, and we'll be able to have a choice to amend our state constitution to include something like Rights of Nature. And that would be such an important tool to help us as a community and us, Lake Worth Waterkeeper, as an organization, to help protect seagrass and other of these critical habitats. I have a really, before we go, I have a really specific example of just kind of what we're up against. And I want to set the stage as one of the developers that is threatening. Actually, he's not threatening, he's already building in Munyon Cove. He's already brought some structures that have already caused damage to the mangroves and the seagrass underneath. Maddie mentioned Johnson seagrass being the only plant in the country that has federal protection. And we use that. We pointed out that these structures that you're going to see in a second that were brought in we're sitting on a seagrass bed that contain Johnsons. And because of our reports and our evidence to agencies like the Department of Environmental Protection, they were forced to come out and they did their own seagrass survey. They identified Johnson seagrass underneath their project, and they essentially had no choice but to take an enforcement action against this developer to remove his junk from the project. And we kind of had a really big step in a victory in that the lower court did give an injunction forcing him to remove his stuff. He moved it from his property, but now they're sitting on Little Munyon Island. And I'm going to share a video that was kindly shared with us by someone who just happened to be out on his boat. And this is something that I always encourage people to do. You can be our eyes and ears, right? Maddie and I and the people who work in Lake Worth Waterkeeper, we're only so many people, and we can only see so much at one time. So everyone here as citizens, as part of the community, when you see something, you can report it to us. You too can take pictures, you can take videos, and those things can be used as evidence. So I'm going to go ahead and play this video. And what you're seeing here from the water, this is Munyon Cove. That is a juvenile green sea turtle. About juvenile, more like maybe like a teenager. And that's a really important highlight. He pans up and you see Little Munyon Island, and you see the structures that are being brought in here without permission or permit. And essentially what this developer has claimed, he's described it as he wants to build a floating Hong Kong, and he wants hundreds of these floating container homes in Munyon Cove that he could sell for a profit. And what the end result would be is floating docks and containers. They're not all floating. This area of the lagoon is very shallow. It's often just a couple feet deep. And when those structures hit the bottom, they kill and they hurt the seagrass. And obviously, it's hard for that to come back. And when the docks are floating, they're shading out the bottom. Plants need sunlight to photosynthesize, so we'll lose that seagrass. And the reason why those turtles here, keep in mind that Munyon Cove is known to have the highest density of juvenile green sea turtles in all of Florida for the most part. And that little area of Munyon Cove puts out so many turtles that we have, the turtles that come out of Lake Worth Lagoon have an effect on the worldwide population. Some of these tagged turtles have been found as far away as Central America, the Yucatan Peninsula, and so on and beyond. And it's a critically important place. And Munyon Cove, they come into Munyon Cove because, like Dr. Chesna's research pointed out, this is one of the few holdouts, not just in Lake Worth Lagoon, but really in a lot of South Florida, where the seagrass in the area is not covered in periphyton, or not as much, at least. Periphyton is an algae that can cover over the grass, and the turtles won't graze on seagrass that's covered in too much periphyton algae. And so we rely on reports. That's a helpful way of allowing us to bring this fight to protect the seagrass, because that enforcement action, starting with DEP, it wouldn't have started if I hadn't gone out there and document the seagrass, which, by the way, I've documented other things too, like juvenile horseshoe crabs We know that horseshoe crabs nest in the area because when it's season, we find them. They're really tiny. You know, they're the size of like an old $half. They're pretty amazing animal. That area of the Lake Worth Lagoon is studied by FWC. They do regular fisheries monitoring there. And some of the things that they find are numerous bonefish, snook, lots of fish that are important for our fisheries industry and that industry. This is a really important place, and if we lose it to development, I think the entire Lake Worth Lagoon is really going to suffer because this is the last holdout. This is the nursery ground for things like bonefish and tarpon and the things that we all love to see out there. And like Joy said, it's a little bit ridiculous that seagrass is not better protected. And we're working on doing better. Like I mentioned, that Florida 5, the rights of nature, when it's not a direct protection to seagrass, but it's going to give organizations like us and even you as a community the tools to stand up to the people who are threatening to destroy these critical habitats. And with that, I think we're gonna close it. And keep in mind, we do plan on doing these Ask the Waterkeeper videos fairly regularly. If you have a question, just go ahead and email us at info@lakeworthwaterkeeper.org. You can always reach out for whatever reason. We have lots of events. Make sure you join our mailing list. You can do that on our website, www.lakeworthwaterkeeper.org. We have quite a bit of information there. Our mailing list, you'll get first notice of a lot of our events. We have some members only events. We have a great one coming up. We have regular education opportunities for kids of all ages, and starting with our lagoonies. And we have all kinds of events coming up and planned. So make sure to follow along. And at those events, you'll be able to learn more about these issues and learn what you can do more. I'll highly suggest you take a look at our next member event. If you become a member, you'll be notified of our next event that's coming up towards the end of this month, where we will be paddling through Munyon Cove and around MacArthur Beach State Park, and hopefully we'll be able to get a chance to see some of the seagrass up close, and especially some of the wildlife like those little juvenile green sea turtles up close. So thank you with that, and hope to see you guys the next time.